Well, good morning, everyone. This is my last of the 4 lectures I've been giving. I've done 2 on time travel, and I'm doing the second one on personal identity this morning. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some more movies, of course, because without movies, what would we have to talk about in a philosophy class? And last time, at the end of the lecture, I left you with a little puzzle. And the puzzle was thinking about fission. If we had the right technology, could we fission people? I asked. A very foolish question to ask, no doubt. And I illustrated it, of course, with the idea of making this kind of physiologically plausible. And that was meant to be a pair of dogs, even though it turned out that the Smiths were a pink dog and a black cat. And the thought was that if you had a being's brain, a dog's brain, a human brain, if you brought the 2 hemispheres into exactly the same informational state and then separated them and kept one hemisphere in the original body and moved the other hemisphere to a body from which the brain had been removed, then was that a kind of way of doing fission? Instead of swapping brains, this is the way we thought about last time when we thought about Locke's theories of memory and identity in the brain of a prince entering and informing the body of a cobbler, as he puts it. Instead of swapping brains, we could then do something else. We could duplicate the brains, swap them across, duplicate one brain, put it into an empty body, and then you'd actually have 2 brains in exactly the same informational state, but occupying 2 different bodies. And if the brain is the seat of consciousness, if the brain is the seat of everything that makes you the person you are, then the fact that there's now 2 equivalent seats of consciousness in 2 different bodies makes it look as if we've made 2 of you, instead of you just being one person all on your own. Now, this raises some really interesting questions. It raises the same sort of questions that we actually encountered when we did our time travel lectures. Because what we want to ask in these questions is not really, is the science possible? Can this really be done? That's not what we're really asking. What we're asking is, can we tell stories about this in ways that are consistent and that are logically coherent? And that was exactly the same test we used when we were talking about personal identity. We were wondering, in the case of time travel, why do I say personal identity? That's exactly the same kind of stories that we were looking at when we looked at time travel. We weren't worried about the physical possibilities of time travel. We were asking, was it possible to tell stories about time travel that are coherent and that are consistent? And when we reach a contradiction, we know that that story's not coherent and not one that we're able to pursue. So why is it then that fission poses a problem for identity? Well, there's a really interesting article that will help you puzzle through some of these questions on the web, and it's in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's called Identity Over Time. Identity Over Time. And it's written by Andrei Galois. And if you look at section 5 of that, there's a lot of heavy technical machinery in sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. But section 5 is actually quite untechnical and quite clear. And it's very clearly written. And he explains there cases of fission and the kind of problems that they gave rise to. But for our purposes to start with, we just need to think about fission as being one problem that, again, just like the time travel problems, it again poses a problem of logic, a problem of coherence and consistency. Indeed, it poses a problem with the logic of identity. Remember the case I discussed last week, which was the case of Charles Robert and Guy Fawkes. Charles wakes up one morning and he's got all the memories of Guy Fawkes. He's got more memories than people have ever written down. So he knows things about 16th and 17th century London at the turn of the century that make it really amazing. People say this guy must be, in some sense, the reincarnation of Guy Fawkes. Charles must be Guy Fawkes. And we had this argument to show that that wasn't a good solution to the question, is Charles Guy Fawkes? By saying, well, suppose a week later somebody else called Robert also wakes up and claims to have all the memories of Guy Fawkes and knows all the ins and outs of 16th and 17th century London. And if that person is in exactly the same condition as Charles, we can't say that person's Guy Fawkes because we've already said Charles is Guy Fawkes. And the logic of this is really simple. If Charles is one and the same as Guy Fawkes, if Charles is identical to Guy Fawkes, and Guy Fawkes is one and the same as Robert, in other words, Charles is identical to Guy Fawkes, Robert's identical to Guy Fawkes, then Charles has to be identical to Robert. And in technical terms, this is called the transitivity of identity. If A is identical to B, B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. But of course, Charles is not identical to Robert, as we pointed out in the lecture last week. There's two of them, so it's false to say that Charles is identical to Robert. So it can't be right. The argument that we've constructed can't be right. It's either false that Charles is identical to Guy Fawkes, or false that Guy Fawkes is identical to Robert, or they're both false, which probably seems the best way to go, to say neither of them are right. Now notice that when I talk about identical in this sense, I'm using the term identical and the word identity in a very strict way. I mean, you often say that things are identical when they're actually not. You know, you have a car that's exactly the same as your friend's car because it's the same model. And you say, my car's identical to yours. But your car isn't identical to your friend's car. What about the scratch on your car that's not on theirs? What about the fact that your car takes up a volume of space and time that's different from the volume of space and time occupied by their car? So in the strict sense of identity, the sense that we're using for these lectures, when A is identical with B, A and B are exactly one thing. It's not that they're two very similar things. For A to be identical with B, A and B must be just one thing, just one thing. And that's why fission poses such a terrible problem, because fission means splitting into two. And when something splits into two, the two survivors of fission, you would say, cannot be identical with the original. If something splits into two, then there's two things, and two things cannot be one thing. And so we're facing this problem of logic and consistency again when we study the notion of fission and what it means for the notion of identity. Okay. So let's start by looking at simple cases of fission and seeing the kind of problems that people get into, and then come back later to look at the questions that are raised by the idea of personal fission, of me fissioning into two, or you fissioning into two. So we'll start with a very different kind of case. We'll start with a very old case, a very old puzzle described in the work of Thomas Hobbes more than 300 years ago, the ship of Theseus. This is a case that's supposedly set in ancient Greece. And for once, I'm able to recommend a Wikipedia article. There's actually an article on Wikipedia that's quite good on this, which is called The Ship of Theseus, strangely enough. And here's the story. The story's straightforward. Theseus and other young men set out from Crete to Athens in a ship of 30 oars. It must have been a galley. The ship was kept by the Athenians for a very long time. Well, actually, just for a long time. And they replaced planks, oars, and sails as they rotted, keeping the ship in excellent condition. Well, of course, they didn't keep it forever, but they kept it for a while in excellent condition. And then it started to decay and degenerate, just like ships do, and people do, and everything does. So here you are. Here's your ship of 30 oars setting out in perfect condition from Crete to Athens. And let's just try and visualize the case by doing one of our space-time diagrams, because we're all four-dimensionalists now. We've all recognized after the time lectures that we are four-dimensional beings. We are worms going through the fabric of space-time. So let's do the space-time diagram. And again, I won't put the wiggles for the worms to have. I'll do the worms with straight lines because it's hard for me to draw wiggles on my computer. So there's space-time diagram, time the vertical axis, space the horizontal axis. And there's the blue line that represents the ship of Theseus setting out. And what happens to the ship of Theseus? It was launched. And at the moment it was launched, we can say that is the ship we are talking about. Why do you say that? Well, because normally you think the identity of something is fixed at its origin. The origin gives you the identity. When you were in the shipyard in those days, they must have had piles of planks and piles of rope and piles of wooden things, pegs for knocking the two bits of wood together, and lots of tar to caulk the seams and all the other things that shipyards are full of. Now, it was an arbitrary matter which plank gets chosen to go in which place in the ship. But once you've selected a certain number of planks and built those planks into the ship, that gives you the ship you have. If there had been different planks put into the ship, then that ship would have consisted of different planks. It's what the ship is constituted by at its origin that makes it the ship it is. So the launch, the origin of the ship, is very important to its identity. It's the same with you and me. If you think about it, we are all the product of a fusion of sex cells, a sperm and an egg. And if it had been a different sperm or a different egg, it wouldn't be you, and it wouldn't be me. It's the origin that makes us what we are uniquely. Each person is unique because each person is a unique combination, very unlikely combination, a unique and very unlikely combination of sex cells. Just think about that. So I can't really say that I could have been born 10 years later. It wouldn't have been me that was born 10 years later. I couldn't really say that I could have lived in the 17th century because there was no way that that sperm and that egg could have been around in the 17th century. So to be me is to be what I'm determined to be by my origin. So origin is very important. So let's follow the story. Theseus and other young men set out from Crete to Athens in the ship of 30 oars. The ship was kept by Athenians for a long time in good condition. Okay, that second arrow on the screen is where the ship was kept in good condition for a long time. And by the end of all this continual repair that went on, by the end of all the continual repair, there wasn't a single plank, let's suppose. There wasn't a single nail. There wasn't a single sail that was original, because the ship had undergone continuous repair all the time. So by the time you get to the second arrow, all the parts of the ship have been renewed. Is it still the same ship? It's got new parts because but it kept sailing all the time. And people tend to say, well, if you change the parts all at once, it might not have been the same ship. But given that you changed them little by little by little, it probably has kept its identity through the changes, because it kept functioning as a ship, didn't it? And there's some philosophers argued about this. There's some funny articles about this in the history of identity arguments. And some people say, so long as you don't replace more than 1/3 of the parts of the ship at any given time, so long as it's not more than 1/3, then you've kept the ship the same. But I mean, you can obviously imagine silly cases. You can say your friend comes along and says, have you seen what I've done to my bicycle? And you say, what have you done? And she says, I've put new wheels, a new frame, new handlebars, new mudguards. Actually, it's completely changed, but it's still my bike. And you say, no, it's not. If you changed it all at once like that, it's not your bike, it's not your original bike anymore. It's a new bike, isn't it? But if you changed it slowly, little bit by little bit, as my colleague says, not more than 1/3 at a time, you change a wheel, it's not a new bike. You change the handlebars on a separate occasion, that's not a new bike either. So long as you change it little by little. So let's imagine that if you change little by little, the ship is still Theseus' ship, even when all the parts have been replaced. Why? And there it goes, sailing off. And I'll put the line at an angle because I'm going to do something nasty in a minute and introduce another line. And of course, it doesn't get so well maintained after that. Let's suppose governments change, companies change, owners of the ship come and go, and eventually it sinks and it rots away, and that's the end of Theseus' ship, because it wasn't kept in such good condition and its rotten planks were not repaired. Now I draw a green line. And the green line is really interesting because what the green line says, what the green line says is actually every time a plank was repaired, there was an eccentric person who used to collect the planks and put them aside. We'll call that person the plank hoarder. And every time a bit of rope was changed and a sail was changed, the plank hoarder hoarded that as well. And so by the time that all the parts had been replaced, by the time you got to the second arrow on the diagram there, the plank hoarder had a complete collection of ship parts. They just weren't assembled into a ship. And that's why I put a little dotted green line before the main green line goes up. And the plank hoarder then painstakingly, somewhere on a little island in ancient Greece somewhere, painstakingly assembles the original ship. Oh! I wish he or she had not done that, because it poses a terrible problem for the logic of identity. These original parts are preserved and rebuilt into Theseus' ship. Now look at what's going on here. Both ships are physically continuous in space and time. The fact that the original ship had been dismantled slowly while it was being repaired and the plank hoarder had collected all the pieces doesn't mean that those pieces had become discontinuous in space and time. Remember, I talked about continuity in the time lecture. These individual planks were continuous in space and time. They just didn't function as a ship for a while. But that's all right. You've got tents, haven't you? You've all gone camping. Your tent isn't kept up all the time. Once you finish camping, you pack it up, you put it on your back, you go home, and it lies in a bag somewhere. It's not functioning as a tent. It's taken apart, put into pieces. And that's what the plank hoarder ship was. It was a ship that was in pieces and then got put together. And so the original parts are preserved and rebuilt into Theseus' ship. So now we've got three things to think about. We can call them temporal parts or temporal stages. Remember, I talked about stages in the time lectures. We've got the stage T1, the one that's being continually repaired until all the planks are replaced. Then there's the stage T2, which is a stage of degeneration, rotting away, finally sinking and being no more. And T3 is the temporal slices of the original planks that have been hoarded. For a while they're separate, and then they're rebuilt into the ship. And the question is, where is Theseus' ship? Oh. What we've got when we look at T2 and T3 are two ships with a common origin. Remember what I said about the importance of origin to identity. We've got two ships with a common origin. Puzzles, puzzles. What will we do? So the question is, which ship is Theseus' ship? What can we say? What can we say? Well, here's the space-time diagram again, just to keep it before your mind. And there's the original ship, T1. There it branches off. At the time that we've got the branching, all the parts in T1 have been replaced. T2 starts off brand new and gradually rots away. There's T3, the plank hoarder ship. Okay, so the questions are, would we say it's T1 and that the other two ships are different ships? That's one possible way of saying it. You say there was an original ship, T1, and there's two new ships that have appeared. T2, which appears in a kind of subtle way out of T1, and T3 that appears in a more bizarre way. Or do we alternatively say maybe it's the continuously functioning ship? Maybe it's T1 plus T2 that's really Theseus' ship, and T3's not really a good candidate for being Theseus' ship. It lay around on the land for a while someone tried to build it up again. When they built it up again, it wouldn't float. It wouldn't float because it had holes in its planks. So how can you call that Theseus' ship? But then, if you were a museum, you might think T1 plus T3 is Theseus' ship, because you might think that getting the original planks and having them rebuilt in their original structures was really important. You might think that's really important to the ship being Theseus' ship, because it's authentic. That one that was repaired and had some modified planks and new-looking sails put on is not authentic. It's not the original. If you think about museums, go to a maritime museum, you often see ships with holes in them because they are trying to preserve old authentic ships. So here's the puzzle. T1 and T2, that combination of stages, that sum of stages, functions continuously as a ship while having its parts gradually replaced. T3 might be of interest to the museum because it contains the original parts and maybe has historic value, so it's maybe more authentically Theseus' ship. But the problem is that once T3 is assembled from all the parts that once belonged to T1, it seems there are rivals for the title Theseus' ship. So it looks as if both the candidates for identity with T1 are physically continuous with it. Only one of them is functionally continuous, and that might tip some of you, when you think about this and you just argue with your friends about it, you might say, well, it's the continuously functioning one, it's the continuing ship, it's the one. But then if you argue with the museum curator, they might say, no, it's the other one. And you have to ask, well, what considerations would tip the balance in the argument one way or the other? Whoa! Now, that gives us a background for turning back to persons and thinking about what happens when we add the puzzle of psychological continuity to the things we've been saying so far. In the case of Theseus' ship, we could argue that there are three ships in the case. There's ship T1, ship T2, and ship T3. Or we could say T2 is a better candidate for being identical with the ship that set out originally with T1. The combination of T1 and T2 is a better candidate for Theseus' ship because it's both physically and functionally continuous with T1. Where I say T2 is a better candidate for being identical with T1, that's actually short for saying T2 and T1 are both stages of the same ship. Because of course T2, as I've got it on the diagram there, is a label for a set of ship stages from one time to a later time. T1 is a label for a set of ship stages from an earlier time to a later time. And it's the combination of T2 and T1 that we're thinking of as being the continuous Theseus ship. Now, when we're dealing with people, not ships, the situation is a lot more complex. For a start, ships don't have memory. And we saw last time when we talked about John Locke that the memory criterion seemed to him to be very important for thinking about personal identity. And when we think about people, we realize that just as we've been talking about planks and plank collections and the continuity of a ship through various stages, that we can also, with people, think about streams of direct and indirect memories that can provide a kind of psychological continuity to the life of a person. So will that help us with fission? Now, I'll change the example a little bit with fission because I'll ask you to think not so much about Mr. and Mrs. Smith and the brain being cut and put into two different bodies, one hemisphere in one body, one hemisphere in another body. I would like you to think instead about movies, because movies make this much easier. And there's two movies, or movies and TV series, that I think we can think about that make it all much easier to think about this. Again, we don't need to worry about physical possibility. We're just thinking about the coherence of the story. There's The Fly. Has anyone seen The Fly? Oh, we are getting to old movies that you've not seen so much of. Some very good results there. I'll tell you about The Fly. And the Star Trek. Has anyone ever heard of Star Trek? Oh, yes. Trekkies still exist. The Fly is a story about a guy who invents pods. He calls them, as I recall the movie, they've actually got this really unpleasant name. They're called disintegrator-integrator pods. And they're disintegrator-integrators, and they're two kind of pods that you climb into. And when you go into the disintegrator-integrator one, you press the buttons, and it disintegrates you, and at the same time you reappear in the pod at the other side of the room. And that means you can move matter across the room. And the horrible thing about The Fly is that the guy gets into the pod to try it on himself, not knowing that a fly's entered the pod as well. And when he appears at the other pod, he's merged with the fly. So he's got the head and one of the arms of a fly. Ah! we won't go to the movie because it gets increasingly silly after that. There's a fly. But the idea of a disintegrator-integrator is a really interesting one. Fly is one of the early movies that has this idea. What if we can use some technology like that to make two versions of someone in just the way a dividing cell makes two versions of itself? There you are. Ed goes into the pod. And Ed somehow doesn't get a fly in there with him, but he manages to use this technology to fission into two people, Fred and Ted. And we get exactly the same question. Fred and Ted, let's suppose, each have Ed's memories. They have Ed's hopes, Ed's intentions. In other words, they seem to represent a stream of psychological continuity that originates with Ed and flows into both Fred and Ted. There's the yellow dotted line to show the stream of psychological continuity. So at the time the transfer is complete, the fission is complete, whatever's happened to these people, at the time of the fission, Fred and Ted are psychologically continuous. And of course, the way to think best about this is the transporter in Star Trek. And so in a moment, I'll just talk about that. But I just want to take a moment to let you think and digest. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. And we'll start again in about a minute while you think about the fly and Star Trek. Or something else. Where was I? Okay, Star Trek. We're going to think about Star Trek next. Now, you remember Beam Me Up, Scotty? You remember that the transporter in Star Trek gives you this magical device which does amazing things. In other sci-fi stories and novels and in philosophy books, it's often called other things. It's called a teleport, a teletransporter. But whatever you call it, it's something that makes fission very easy. It dematerializes people, it dematerializes them, and then it rematerializes them. Apparently in Star Trek, the time between dematerialization and rematerialization is about 4 seconds. And according to some understandings of how the transporter in Star Trek works, it's limited to just a few tens of thousands of kilometers, maybe 30,000 kilometers. I learned that from the Wikipedia article on the transporter. And there are two models that you can think about of how the Star Trek style transporter works. Remember, it goes bzzz, and you go all fizzy, and then you appear somewhere else all fizzy, and you're all right again. But these are important differences. One way of thinking about it is that it actually, when you go in the transporter, it breaks your body down into its component molecules, maybe even finer bits in molecules, maybe atoms, maybe something finer than atoms, who knows, and it beams these through space at a great speed, hence the phrase, beam me up. If that's what's happening, then since all your body elements at some very fine microscopic level are going through space, then you've still got physical continuity. You've got physical continuity of the body. But that looks an unlikely way to give you fission, because if you've got physical continuity of all your body parts going through space and then you appear somewhere else, how can you get fission? Here's another way of thinking about it that would make fission possible. The transporter in Star Trek makes a blueprint of an entire body and then sends the blueprint to the receiving station while destroying the body. Whoa. So your body gets destroyed, but only a blueprint gets sent. That's why it can travel so fast. It's not sending atoms or quarks or anything through space. It's just sending a blueprint. A new body matching the blueprint is manufactured from a stock of atoms and molecules and various other important elements stored in a big bubbling vat at the receiving station, right? So you've got the receiving station rebuilds the new body. But notice that if that's how the transporter works, it destroys physical continuity. Because in effect, you're killed when you enter the transporter, and then a replica of you is created at the other end. But that replica has an interesting feature. It's got all your intentions, memories, and ambitions. So that replica preserves psychological continuity. So we've got two models here, one that preserves physical and psychological continuity. That's the breakdown model. With the other model we've got actually destroys physical continuity but preserves psychological continuity. And if you think back to last week's lecture on John Locke and the Prince and the Cobbler, you'll see that Locke would think actually that that's fine, that both of them preserve the person, because Locke thought that psychological continuity was what really mattered to personal identity. But would we want to agree? Now, it's the second form of transporting. It's the second form that makes fission possible. It's the second form that makes fission possible. How does that work? Well, we just need to be a little bit imaginative in the way we think about the transporter. It could be that the transporter malfunctions, or, as is suggested in some episodes of Star Trek, that it keeps a copy of the original blueprint so that if the transporting goes wrong, it can somehow rebuild you back at the original transport station. How could it malfunction? Well, for instance, it might stutter and by mistake produce two copies at other places of you. Instead of just producing one, you rematerialize twice. You have the stuttering transporter. Or another possibility is you rematerialize over there, but it fails to destroy the body over here. So you've got two copies of you. Or you materialize over there, it thinks it's gone wrong, and it rebuilds your body back at the original sending station so that it restores the original from the blueprint it keeps. In all these cases, you get two copies. So speaking loosely, speaking not in the language of numerical identity and oneness, we could say that Ed could use the transporter so there will be two of him in future, even though there's only one of him just now, speaking in a loose and popular way. Because what we might want to say is that Ed and Fred, Ed and Ted, are actually all stages. Oh, wait a minute, what are they stages of? Ed plus Fred looks like stages of a continuing, psychologically continuous person. But then so Ed and Ted do as well. So the combination Fred and Ed looks just as much a candidate for being a person as the combination Ed and Ted. How are we going to solve that? Now, what we can say is if Ed's trying to make two of him in future, which one of these two future people is really Ed? Now, that might be a confusing and confused question, but let's just think about the possibilities. You might say that since each of Ted and Fred are psychologically continuous with Ed, maybe Ed has actually managed to do something quite amazing here using the transporter technology. Maybe Ed has managed to survive twice over. How can a double success be a failure? Transporting once isn't a problem. Stuttering, why is that a problem? Why isn't that doubly good? Oh, there used to be only one of me, now there's two of me. But the question of identity continues to puzzle us because we're talking in a loose and popular way, not in a strict and philosophical way here. Now, one solution to this problem was quite interesting, put by David Lewis, person you read about in Thinking About Grandfather Paradox, is actually to say that when Ed was there originally, there were two people. You didn't realize there were two people, just looked like there was one person in the room when you went into a room and met Ed. But actually there were two, because Ed was going to fission into Fred and Ted. And so it just happens that Fred and Ted shared a stage, shared a series of temporal parts or temporal slices that we labeled Ed. That's quite good, isn't it? So actually, if you think about it, you made a mistake when you thought Ed was one. Ed was actually a part, a series of temporal slices or stages, a part of both Fred and Ted. He was an earlier part of both people. And it just so happened that these people were together in a very intimate way for that earlier part. They weren't side by side, they were in one body. So David Lewis says, Ed was two people all along. That's Fred and Ted. They shared the body called Ed. So there were always two people there. One person is the combination of Fred and Ed, that series of stages. The other person is the combination of Ted and Ed, that series of stages. Okay. And in that way of thinking, Ed's an earlier stage of both Fred and Ted. Another way of thinking that's put forward by other writers is that Ed actually died at the time of the transport, because transporting destroys your body. So Ed actually died at the time the transporter destroyed his body, but he's survived by Fred and Ted. And maybe we don't need a relation as strong as the identity relation to capture what matters. Maybe what matters for you and me in thinking about our future, if we're going to have a future, is thinking that we survive. Not that we stay identical with the person we are just now, but that we survive into the future. And it might be that you can survive in a different body. Maybe modern medicine can have technology for taking all your programming off you and installing it into some future improved body. That might be survival. And maybe that's what's happened in the transporter case. Maybe Ed has died, but he's survived as Fred and Ted. But that raises the question, what does survival mean in a case like this? And I presume that the simplest way of thinking about survival here is it's not an identity relation. We're not saying Ed is identical to two people. That'd be silly. Ed can't be both Fred and Ted, and two people can't be one. Survival means that your body dies, but that your memories, or some things very like your memories, continue in other bodies. There's a whole lot of literature about memory here, which I'm not bothering to introduce because it will make life complicated. But the general view would be that survival means that either your memories or something very like your memories continue on in other bodies. But then this raises a terrible problem. And the problem is, well, are we really so independent of our bodies? Is it really the case that we can make sense of personal survival as not involving the body? Is that not underplaying the importance of bodies to who we are and what we are? Wow. Now, when you go through all that, it leaves you in the following situation, that the problem of numerical identity is a puzzling one. And it's easy to get confused when you talk about numerical identity. I even noticed when I was going through my slides that they weren't as clear as they might be, because it's very easy to slip into ways of talking that are not strict and precise about this. In the sense of numerical identity, John, remember the Smiths before they became dogs, they were a kind of 2nd century AD couple in stone. John was the same person as Mr. Smith. In our normal ways of thinking about it, John is the same person as Mr. Smith. When John has the same body as Mr. Smith, exactly the same body as Mr. Smith. When John has the same brain as Mr. Smith, thinking of the brain in realistic terms as the seat of consciousness, the seat of your memories, the seat of your desires, the seat of your ambitions, your intentions, all the things that give you psychological continuity. So John has the same body as Mr. Smith, he has the same brain as Mr. Smith, and he's psychologically continuous with Mr. Smith. They share the very same memories, they share the very same intentions, and so on. And that's the kind of paradigm, standard, basic case of numerical identity. When we find an early stage of someone, and then we meet a later stage of that person, and you say, oh, aren't you the person I used to know as Mr. Smith? And he says, yes, but you can call me John now. And when you meet John, and you say, is John Mr. Smith? Is this stage that I'm talking to just now, this slice of a person I'm talking to just now, is this the same as Mr. Smith? Well, he's got the same body, he's got the same brain, and he's psychologically continuous, because when I talk to him, he remembers all the things I remember about our previous meetings. So he's got the same body, same brain, psychological continuous. Then this slice that I'm now calling John, and that slice that I call Mr. Smith, are both slices of one and the same person. Easy, easy. So in the standard case, that's what we get. We get psychological continuity, sameness of brain, sameness of body. And these are the conditions that normally hold when we talk about personal identity. In order to allocate an earlier slice of someone and a later slice of someone as slices of the very same person, we expect these three conditions to hold. But that's where our thought experiments, our ideas about pods and transporters and brain splitting, these thought experiments have raised abnormal cases. And in these abnormal cases, we find it very hard to decide between whether we should put the weight on bodily continuity as what preserves identity over time. Is it bodily continuity that does that? Or is it psychological continuity? Psychological continuity in your textbook, The Philosophy Gym, is called stream theory. Everyone else calls it psychological continuity, but the Philosophy Gym calls it stream theory. Now, as we saw in the last lecture, for John Locke, when he was writing, the thing that really matters to human identity, the thing that matters for attributing responsibility for your previous actions, the things that really matters to your identity as a person, is not your bodily identity, but your psychological continuity. And that's the problem that we're still facing after we've been through our science fiction examples. That does seem to be the view taken by Star Trek. It does seem to me that someone who was afraid of going into a transporter would probably have good grounds for being afraid. Because if someone says, actually, don't worry about this, you're just going to go into a machine that mashes you up. But somewhere else, someone's going to emerge looking like you and with all your memories and intentions intact. That's all right, isn't it? That's okay. So go and beam. And you can see that not everyone will be absolutely convinced by this as a safe form of transport. There are some people who are frightened of flying, for goodness sake. If you're afraid of flying, what are you going to feel like when you go to a transporter? Nobody mashes you up to send you on an airplane. You stay intact on your airplane. Then you arrive at the other end exactly the same body, same mind as you went on with. Now, in the transporter case, Star Trek actually supports the idea that Locke was right, that it's the psychological continuity of memories, intentions, beliefs, desires, and so on, that make the person. And that seems to be something that people who watch movies are quite happy to go along with. The question I like to ask is, well, if they were actually faced in reality with a transporter, would they be happy to step into it? So I hope that's given you enough material to think about in your discussions and in your tutorials. I've enjoyed the 4 lectures. Thank you for coming along, being such a good audience. Thank you.